swiftly for this press briefing to start. Would like to start by apologizing for starting a few minutes late, and that was because of some technical issues that we were having here. I'm sure you've seen colleagues from our IT section running around trying to make sure that we do come to you and we do give you a quality resolution of this press briefing. So let me start by thanking you very much for your patience, and that the Commissioner is now here with us and he's going to be talking to us very shortly. But let me make some introductory remarks. My name is Wayne Musabayana. I'm Head of Communication at the African Union Commission. Our panelist today, our guest, who is also our host, is His Excellency Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, and he is the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. And we are holding this virtual press conference from the headquarters of the African Union. And he is going to be speaking on the efforts of the African Union to promote good governance, peace, security, and stability in Africa. Now, primarily, the Commissioner is going to be addressing us on the issue of the situation in Sudan. But as per the media advisory that we sent out, he's also going to be taking questions after his briefing on the following issues. The first one, you are free during the Q&A session to also ask questions on the updates on the Ethiopian peace process. You may also ask questions regarding the political transition processes in Burkina Faso, in Chad, in Guinea, and in Mali, including, of course, Sudan, which will be the focal point of this briefing. The Commissioner is available to take questions on the general situation in the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin area, the ATMIS transition and the security situation in Somalia, the Horn of Africa, and northern Mozambique. Finally, you may also ask questions on the institutional landmarks in the Political Affairs, Peace and Security Department since March 2021. I just want to reiterate that the focal point of our briefing today is on the situation in Sudan. So shortly, I will hand over to the Commissioner, who will give us that briefing on Sudan. And then we will then move on to our question and answer section. So I'd just like to give you information on how you can send your questions in to us. One of those ways is to send in your questions through the question and answer platform on this Zoom link, and also by utilizing the WhatsApp number +251 929 487749. Let me come back again with that WhatsApp number. It is +251 929487749. All right, it is now time for us to get to our briefing and to hear from His Excellency Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, who is the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, to give us that briefing on Sudan. Commissioner, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wayne. Gentlemen of the press, greetings from Addis Ababa. Today, on behalf of the chairperson of the Commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Muhammad, I would like to share with you African Union's contributions to advancing good governance, peace, security, and stability on our continent. I will also be ready to respond to your questions or comments. It is important to highlight that the major thrust of this briefing will be on the situation in Sudan. On Sudan specifically, you will recall the role of the African Union in support of the Sudanese national actors, which resulted in the August 2019 transitional agreement. This was after the overthrow of former President al-Bashir in April 2019. The agreement enabled relative stability for 2 years and included the signing in 2020 of the Juba Agreement with Sudanese armed groups. During this time, Sudan was also removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism by the United States government. We also witnessed Sudan's return to the international community with key benefits towards debt relief and economic and development assistance after decades of sanctions. However, the October military takeover, October 2021, virtually brought the civilian transition to an end. And this led, regrettably, to the suspension of the Republic of Sudan by the African Union Peace and Security Council in October 2021. It should be further recalled that the chairperson traveled 5 times in recent times to engage with the military and civilian actors to impress upon them the urgency to reach an inclusive agreement for the return to a civilian-led government and ensure that elections were held timely. As Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and
Recording
Security,
in progress.
I accompanied the chairperson on his last visit in mid-February this year. Since the descent into violent conflict on 15 April 2023 between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, the African Union has stayed engaged to address this tragic situation. First, the chairperson of the African Union Commission issued a statement immediately calling for an urgent de-escalation, a ceasefire, and return to dialogue for the sake of the people of Sudan. 24 hours after the conflict started, the African Union Peace and Security Council convened in an emergency session, condemned the fighting, and also called for unconditional cessation of hostilities between the two belligerent groups. The Council mandated the Chairperson Commission to remain seized of this matter and do all within its good offices to ensure that a ceasefire will hold. Subsequently, on Thursday, 20th April, the chairperson further convened a high-level global meeting in emergency session of all actors, including United Nations Secretary General, the regional body IGAD, the League of Arab States, the European Union, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the African members of the UN Security Council, and the neighbors of Sudan, as well as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. This AU-led emergency session agreed on critical steps to further demonstrate the need for the guns to be silenced in Sudan. First, they condemned the tragic violence and called for immediate humanitarian ceasefire to allow the observance of the Muslim holiday Eid al-Fitr, with a view to pave the way for a more permanent, unconditional cessation of hostilities. This global meeting also demanded that the belligerents establish humanitarian corridors to allow for unhindered humanitarian access to address the urgent and immediate needs of the population, including the rehabilitation of and civilian use of critical basic infrastructure, particularly water and electricity services. This meeting also called for the respect of the safety of all and protection of all diplomatic and international organizations based in Khartoum and other parts of Sudan. Given the status of the ongoing conflict then, the meeting also called for urgent resumption of political process through dialogue, reconciliation, and negotiation. These global stakeholders agreed will help towards the setup of an inclusive civilian-led administration. It was also important that the AU, along with all its actors and partners, strongly rejected any form of external interference in Sudan. It is also critical for us to inform the public that the need for coordination, collaboration, and harmonization of efforts, unity of efforts in getting to common action to stop the bloodshed in Sudan. Furthermore, the African Union and partners called on the trilateral mechanism comprising African Union, United Nations, and IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, to engage with the Arab League and the European Union, the Troika, and other bilateral actors to immediately engage the leadership of the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces towards negotiated solution of this crisis. The enlarged mechanism is expected to continue to meet and to work towards the practical steps to address the issues of humanitarian access, ensure that the ceasefire is fully monitored, and the resumption of political dialogue. Let me use this opportunity to re-emphasize that the African Union continues to re-emphasize guiding principles that no military victory will solve this crisis. It is also important to renew the call that only a political process that is inclusive of all Sudanese-owned parties will help in solving this crisis rather than the embrace of any foreign interference. This crisis must be tackled within the ambit of silencing the guns. I wish to also recall that the meeting of April 20th mandated the African Union and the United Nations to coordinate international actors on Sudan with the objective of urgently ending the violence and the steps being made toward the stabilization of Sudan, the region, and our continent. There's, of course, a real risk of regional conflagration of this crisis, and indeed, a form of internationalization of the conflict. Towards this end, there's a real need for the international community to continue to speak and act as one, better coordinated for the good of the people of Sudan. Let me end by reiterating the African Union's full solidarity and support with the people of Sudan as we call on the two generals to stop the fighting. Let me emphasize that the African Union, working with its partners, will continue to exert international diplomatic pressure on the belligerent parties. We call on them, we reiterate the call, renew the call for permanent ceasefire in the supreme interest of the good people of Sudan. I thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was His Excellency Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, the Commissioner, the African Union Commission. As we said, his briefing was going to be on Sudan, but during the Q&A, you are free to ask questions from any of those categories that we highlighted earlier on. So straight on to the question and answer section. Commissioner, we have questions that have come in about Sudan and a number of others, but I will start with the ones on Sudan. So the first one is coming from Simon Marks, and Simon what signs from either of the warring partners in Sudan of holding talks? That's one question. Then he has a second question, and he says, what can Union playing and which channel seems to be the most likely for holding mediation talks in the light of the US and Saudi Arabia appearing? Questions for you, Commissioner, from Simon Marks.
Thank you very much for the question. Let me reaffirm my earlier statement, is that the parties are being engaged directly as well as through their senior officials towards the need to silence the guns. In particular, the role of the African Union, working with the critical players, the United Nations, IGAD, League of Arab States, the European Union, is to ensure that they see the need to silence the guns immediately and permanently. It is for this reason that the channels that are open to us in mediation and dialogue continue to be used through the good offices of the chairperson of the commission, who has stayed engaged with the leadership of the two warring parties. The other channels also include neighboring states and countries with much influence around the world, the Gulf Arab states, to ensure that we all speak, act in a coordinated manner on a global security interest for a stop to the fighting. This channel, where the chairperson of the commission was mandated by the Peace and Security Council to do his power, and he has expressed readiness that once the two generals guarantee and reopen the airport, the chairperson of the commission will be in Khartoum to speak, or any part of Sudan, or any part of the world, to engage with the parties towards a resolution. It is also important to emphasize that this crisis must be tackled, all of us globally, within the confines and the principles that guide the African Union. And as you know very well, the African Union has just come out successfully the Ethiopian peace process in northern Ethiopia, where the agreement that was signed in Pretoria on the 2nd of November 2022 should inspire the belligerents in Khartoum that there is always light at the end of the tunnel. And the possibility is for us to use the goodwill, the solidarity that exists in the African Union to end this unnecessary conflict. The end goal is to protect Sudanese civilians, to protect diplomatic missions, so that civilians are not going to fall victim to this conflict. And the only way to do that on a long-term basis is to halt the fighting. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We have a question now that's, in fact, we have two questions that are coming in from Sophie Mukwena, who is with the Corporation, whom I believe are broadcasting briefing live. Thank you very much, Sophie, for that. And question, the ceasefire is not holding. Has the AU appointing a mediation team? That's the first question. The second question is, there are reports that the conflict is now a proxy war of powerful nations. Commissioner, over to you.
It is obvious that the Herculean task to ensure ensure holds permanently, while the humanitarian truce will also be effective. From our vantage point in Addis Ababa, we want to re-emphasize that and call on the parties to respect the international political will for the ceasefire to hold. Yes, we have many options, many channels, including the offices, the good offices of the chairperson of the commission, to mediate in this crisis, and that is being done. We have also set up a task team internally in the commission on a daily basis to monitor the situation and engage critical stakeholders, putting the pressure on the parties for mediation and dialogue. We, as the African Union, will not tolerate the East African region of our continent. We have called strongly for no internationalization of this conflict. We have condemned any interference by external actors. And we appeal to the international community to rally behind the African Union and join in ensuring that this does not become a proxy war. The good people of Sudan desire peace and stability. The good people of Sudan have cried for years for democracy. This is what they desire. And we see the hope of peace dividends once democratic governance comes to play. The military is people for constitutionalism, the rule of law, and restoration of democracy. So once again, we are assured by the international coalition that the African Union is building that proxy wars and external interference will not be a day in Sudan. We want to assure ourselves and the international community that given the state of peace, the precarious state of peace and security on our continent, a full-blown civil war with foreign interests in Sudan would not be beneficial to Sudan, to the Horn of Africa region, or to our entire continent. Thank you.
We move on now to a question that is coming from Kennedy, who is with the Voice of America in Addis Ababa. And his question is on the Ethiopian peace process. So Kennedy says, have the peace negotiations between the Ethiopian government and the Oromo Liberation Army commenced? If so, can you brief us about the progress so far?
We encourage all member states, including Ethiopia, to continue to use all mechanisms available to the African Union to silence the guns and address conflict resolution and management from the perspective of African solutions to African problems. We are very pleased that a few days ago, the Ethiopian government recognized the immense contributions of the African Union Commission, its organ, the African Union Peace and Security Council, in the work of peace in Tigray. And we will be pleased with the Pretoria Agreement inspiring peace processes not only within Ethiopia, but around our continent. Because this agreement with Tigray is being called a miracle agreement, where for the past 6 months, in 4 days, it will be 6 months exactly, and no gun has been fired. I believe that will be a huge inspiration to the other armed groups who seem to be operating in Ethiopia. Our goal is that we silence the guns, we end all conflicts by the year 2030. It will be a welcome development as Ethiopia or entities engage in conflict management and resolution for the betterment of our people and the redirection of all efforts towards attaining the Africa we want. I thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have follow-up questions on the Ethiopian situation, and these are coming from Kidan Abebe, who is with the Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation. And he says, what efforts are underway by the African Union to increase commitment of African leaders towards entering a new phase in the peace and security of Africa? That's one. Additionally, how does the African Union perceive Ethiopia's commitment to peace, particularly in the talks being held with the OLF in Tanzania? 2 questions there for you, Commissioner, from the Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation.
Yes, I think the latter part of the question has been answered. We see that the Pretoria Agreement on Tigray will inspire all forms of engagement to silence the guns on our continent. Specifically on the Ethiopian peace process, we are indeed very pleased that the peace process has continued and our efforts must be
has occurred here. But while we are doing that, I just want to remind you that we are here at the African Union in Addis Ababa, and we are in a press briefing with His Excellency Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, and he's the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security. And he's holding this briefing on the Union's efforts to promote good governance, peace, security, and stability in Africa. As some of you who have been with us since the beginning have heard, we are focusing mostly on the situation in Sudan. I'm sure many of you have been following what is going on in Sudan. But the Commissioner has also indicated that he is open to receiving questions regarding other issues of peace and security on the continent. Specifically, he has highlighted that you may ask questions that are relating to the update on the Ethiopian peace process, and I think we've already questions regarding that particular issue. He's also open to take questions on the political transition in Burkina Faso, in Chad, in Guinea, and in Mali. And I will continue to give you further breakdown on other areas that is willing to provide questions on. But I understand that we are now back on, can continue with our briefing. So, Commissioner, we have a question that's coming from Dawit Endashaw, and he is with Reuters. Dawit wants to know if there is any other action, and I think he means apart from what you've just mentioned already, is there any other new action is planning to take regarding the war in Sudan and resolving it? Any additional information?
Well, thank you for the question. I will reaffirm that for peace remain within the good offices of the chairperson of the commission. And we are committed to engage with stakeholders and partners to re-emphasize the need for a permanent ceasefire, because this is a tragic, unnecessary conflict. It's avoidable, needs to be back on track. We have to also work steadily with neighbors of Sudan. And I believe all this, given that any form of external interference of Sudan. I want to assure you that we are working with all stakeholders, engaging with the people of Sudan through different groups, working with a political party and working with our partners on one condition, that this is not the time to take sides between the Sudanese or the rapid support forces. Rather, this is the time to call for silencing the guns collectively and for us to bring the belligerent parties to the negotiating table. All opportunities that we have will be explored to better find an amicable resolution of this conflict. Thank you.
We move on now to questions that are coming from Nick Mudimba, who is with the CGTN. And Nick has two questions. The first one, of other African nationalities trapped in Sudan. The second question, the medias from the EAC have not been able to make progress. Has there been any follow-up, even as the airspace is still closed?
As it affects many African students, African citizens who happen to be living in Sudan at the time. I want to assure you that we are in constant consultation through this hub with the Commissioner, the African Union Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian Affairs, and Social Development, who handles all humanitarian affairs. But given the connection to conflict, this department and the African Union as a whole will continue to work with all stakeholders. We are monitoring the situation of evacuation of civilians to different parts of the neighboring countries. We encourage our member states to continue to work with us in the Commission, in the AU, to ensure that we have our citizens back to safety. And we use this opportunity to reiterate to the belligerents their international obligations, full adherence and respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law must continue to be the hallmark, even while the conflict goes on. I want to really thank you all, except there are any other further questions.
Commissioner, we still have a question. Shall we proceed?
Yes.
All right, so now we move on to questions from Sisai Salu, who is a reporter with the Ethiopian Reporter newspaper. He has sent us 3 questions. Sisai, I want to say that 2 of your questions have already been answered. And the first one that's been answered is there a role that the AU is playing in the negotiations that are ongoing between the Ethiopian government and the OLA in Tanzania? Commissioner has already responded to a similar question. And he has also responded to a question, what has been done to avert and stop international actors as catalysts in the conflicts? So we are not going to respond to those 2 questions, Sisai. We will just respond to your second question. And Commissioner Sisai says, as silencing the guns is one of the flagship projects under the African Union's Agenda 2063, political, civil unrest, identity, resource-based and terrorism coups continuing on the continent. In this regard, how do you evaluate this and see the effort by the African Union to minimize and achieve the goals of Agenda 2063?
The African Union continues to prioritize the full implementation, speedy implementation of Agenda 2063, which is now in its second 10-year implementation phase. But most importantly, silencing the guns by 2030 remains very important to our endeavors. The need for the nexus between peace, security, and development, and the robust response by the African Union through the regional economic communities and regional mechanisms, including ECOWAS, SADC, COMESA, UMA, IGAD, East African Community, to address all the challenges we face. So we are speeding up our realization of silencing the guns, but I must also warn that this is a very difficult one, given the exponential spread of violent extremism and terrorism on our continent. But we are committed because of our leaders in the African Union have exhibited the highest form of political will. Second, we are stepping up our own ability to mobilize resources, financial, human, technical, knowledge, to address the myriad of security threats that we face on our continent. So let me assure you that the silencing the guns is on track. The chairperson earlier this year appointed His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chambers, former president of the ECOWAS Commission and former UN Under Secretary General for the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel, as High Representative for silencing the guns. He has already started in this role by engaging critical stakeholders in the UN and to silence the guns properly. And when we talk of silencing the guns, we must look at all the gamut of the political, environmental, economic, social, and cultural aspects, including addressing the scourge of small arms and light weapons. Africa must rally to silence the guns. And I agree with you that Sudan presents the greatest danger as we speak. Thank you.
Adetunji Omotola, who is a presenter with a program called Afrospace, says, "Sir, you indicated that the African Union does not want to see any outside interference. So far, the death toll has reached 450. What if thousands get slaughtered? Would the AU change that position? Would that change the AU position?" That's one. Then he goes on to say, "A few days ago, we heard the sad news that Nigerian students fleeing the conflicts were turned back from the Ethiopian border due to lack of visas. What is your take on this?"
I think we should differentiate between external interference and support for clear means of the resolution to the conflict. As I stated earlier in my presentation, we already have a global contact group of key players in the international system, strategic member states of the African Union, who are working to ensure that we do not reach thousands of casualties in this conflict. It is therefore critical, as you stated, that we must prevent further escalation of the conflict. All the regional leaders have been engaged. IGAD leaders have even volunteered to visit the two generals once the situation permits. It is therefore in our self-interest enlightened self-interest as the African Union in its entirety to bring together the forces for good. So the forces that are divisive or supporting one side against the other will not be in furtherance of silencing the guns. Your second part of the question, I want to assure you that we started also engaging with stakeholders in the neighboring countries, including the State Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, to address the concerns being raised by African students, African citizens, as to the entry. I can say categorically that we are pleased that the neighboring countries have continued to welcome those African citizens who were found to be crossing their border. This is full respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law. So we are, and even other countries that are ready to support us, including United Nations specialized agencies, to ensure that international law is fully respected and no one will face the right to be turned back into a zone that is of violent conflict at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. I've been advised that we have a further 15 minutes to go, so we'll try to cover as many of your questions as possible within that remaining time. So we now go to a question that has come through from Henok Tesfaye, and he's with China Central Television. Henok says, could you brief us on the damage that is being caused by the war? Commissioner, I'm assuming that Henok is talking about the Ethiopian situation or Sudan. So Henok, you are referring to the question of the war in Sudan, and you are asking about the damage that is being caused. And he also goes on to say, what about the displacement and migration that is happening? Finally, he says, how is the African Union prepared to respond to the possible humanitarian crisis?
Obviously, huge damage is being done to national critical infrastructure in Khartoum and the other many cities that the fighting has reached on. Water, electricity, as I stated in my statement, have been damaged. And as you must know, the economy of Sudan was already in dire straits before the conflict. So we're talking of the whole of Sudan, the people of Sudan having to face crisis upon crisis. What you can say is double jeopardy. And that is why our response must be robust as the African Union and as the international community to address the challenges that will face internally displaced persons, refugees, and indeed the international community that remains in Sudan. I want to assure you that this war is not in any way going to leave Sudan in a better shape. It's marks of power struggle that is totally unnecessary, given the possibility of always consultation, dialogue, and reconciliation. Thank you.
Our next question is coming from Nick Mudimba. That's his second round, and he's with CGTN. And Nick says there are reports that the Eritrean forces are still in Tigray. What is the African Union position on this?
Based on the Pretoria Agreement signed on the 2nd of November 2022 in South Africa, the parties agreed to the withdrawal of all non-Ethiopian national defense forces. It is therefore clear to us that we renew the call for all such forces to withdraw from the Tigray region. I want to assure you that the reports we get from our African Union team of experts in monitoring, verifying, and in compliance mission, we get very positive developments regarding this particular provision in the agreement. This is critical moving forward to ensure that both sides build the trust for the Tigray peace process to be consolidated, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration to work. So my clarion call is for us to continue to work towards the full implementation of the agreement, particularly the relevant articles dealing with the withdrawal of all non-Ethiopian national defense forces. I thank
you. Thank you, Commissioner. I think that we'll take our last question, and we are done with questions from the media, but there is one question from Ruben Kipkoech, and he is asking on behalf of the youths. And he says, I believe that as youths...
Governance. The first is that in the last 1 year, we have established the White Youth Mechanism to promote mediation and dialogue in all our countries. We are engaging with many of the youth groups to emphasize that inclusion of the youth in the political process and empowerment, given the opportunities and their role in building greater economies on our continent through the avenue of ICT, should be promoted. I want to assure you that we are also scaling up the support for the youth in better orientation regarding democracy, elections, and transitional justice. Having just engaged with the Commonwealth and other stakeholders, we will be planning a joint training on democratic governance and election monitoring for the youth specifically before the end of the year. But where the issue is that the youth remains both victims and perpetrators of most of the insecurity on our continent. Therefore, we have to invest more in early warning, invest more in de-radicalization programs, invest more in conflict prevention, so that the potentials of the youth could be further rolled out in the Africa that we want. Without the youth, without women inclusion in political spaces, without the role of the civil society where the youth participate, our Africa aspirations will be incomplete. So I want to assure you that we are working closely with the ambassadors, the youth ambassadors for peace, and the special envoy on youth matters in the office of the chairperson. Together, we believe we can energize our member states, our regional economic communities, the stakeholders, to build a union of the people. And that union of the people must, of course, be driven and inspired by the youth of our continent. Thank you very much. I wish to use this opportunity again to appreciate a very effective interaction that we have had today. And once again, I promise to do this as regularly as I can so that the media will be better informed of what we're doing. Let's continue to work and pray for the peace of Sudan and, of course, the peace of our continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was His Excellency Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, who is the African Union for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, who was holding this virtual press briefing to advise us or to update us on the African Union efforts to promote governance, peace, security, and stability in Africa. And as stated at the beginning, the focus was really on the situation in Sudan, but Commissioner also attended to various other issues of peace and security, as well as governance on the continent. So it is my pleasure to thank His Excellency the Commissioner for having taken this time to be with us, and to thank the whole technical team that has worked past the odds of those technical challenges to make sure that we are able to communicate. I am aware that our colleagues online who had indicated their questions, please can you send your questions to +251 929 48749. Thank you very much from all of us here. Have a very good night.